Tell her body her choice until a woman chooses to cover herself.
I find that the women of today truly hate when you're modest. Modest in the way you dress, modest in the way you carry yourself. God forbid you don't smoke or drink.
When Christians are talking about modesty, do you get scared like I do?
Let me blow your mind for just a minute. I can take this off my head right now if I wanted to and throw it on the floor, and there is nobody around me to stop me, including my husband, because I don't wear it for my husband. I, a singular human being with a brain, choose to wear this. So, I don't wear it for my husband. I don't wear it for anybody else. I choose to wear it.
Social media has corrupted the meaning of hijab.
There's nothing like having a conversation with an Islamophobe, and when you realize, because I've always had this belief that hijab is very powerful and it's a weapon, and when they see it, they hate it. And
Allah's greatest child to man is to lower his gaze, and Allah's greatest child to women is to cover herself, because men are eager to look and women are eager to be looked at.
The goddess have planted white roses when I specifically asked for red.
You could always paint the roses red.
What an odd thing to say.
Hijab is hard, and I'm sick of telling Muslim women to pretend that it's not. A lot of people get really upset with hijabis talking about difficulties or struggles with the hijab because they say that it could discourage people from wearing it or encourage people to take it off. But I don't think the solution is to perpetuate this narrative that it's sunshine and rainbows, because it's not supposed to be an easy thing. I think instead we should push forward this narrative that just because something is hard does not mean that it's not worth doing. Normalizing the idea that hijab is hard can actually help so many other women, because then when they struggle, they don't feel like they're the outlier. And instead of seeing it as a sign that they're not cut out for it, they would understand that these challenges are a normal, natural part of the process. Law school is hard, starting a business is hard, medical school is hard, and people take on these responsibilities and challenges with the knowledge that it is hard.
The hardest thing any Muslim can do in this day and age is wear hijab.
When we talk about modesty today, most people imagine it as this kind of outdated, old-fashioned idea that's only relevant if you grew up in a religious household or if you had strict parents. But modesty has always been a much deeper concept than just cover your body. In sociology, modesty refers to the rules and expectations a society creates around how we present ourselves. Chris Schilling, a sociologist who studies the relationship between bodies and culture, defines modesty as the cultural norms governing the presentation of the body and the boundaries of what acceptable exposure is. That basically means that every society has lines that you're not supposed to cross, depending on the time and place. In Islam, modesty is rooted in a spiritual idea called haya. It doesn't necessarily mean dressing a certain way. It means having a sense of humility and respect that guides the way you behave, the way you speak, and the way you interact with everyone else. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that modesty is a branch of faith. And this shows that it's more than just clothing. It's a moral quality that shapes your character. So when we talk about modesty, we're talking about something that's both social and spiritual. The key point here is that modesty has never been an optional idea or a fringe thing. Every culture has its modesty norms, whether we want to admit that or not. The difference is in what those norms look like. And that's important to understand before we get into why hijab feels difficult today. Because the challenge isn't that modesty itself is strange or extreme. It's that our society has created a new version of modesty, one that's basically the opposite of what modesty has been for generations. When people talk about modesty today, they act like it's some kind of weird, inherited, old-fashioned, oppressive norm that we impose onto our society. But if you look at history honestly, modesty has been a completely normal part of the mainstream, and it was never really an exception. And it wasn't just limited to religious groups. Even civilizations that we now romanticize as sexually liberated had pretty strict expectations about how you cover your body. Take ancient Greek, for example. We often imagine it as this place where everyone walked around half naked, like when we look at the statues that we notice in these art galleries and stuff. But in reality, those statues were exaggerated representations of ideals and not everyday life. Greek women were expected to cover their bodies with garments, and public nudity for women was strongly discouraged. Historian Susan Blundell points out that modesty was a marker of respectable womanhood in Greek society. So even back then, modesty wasn't just personal preference, it was a social expectation. And the same is true for the ancient Romans. Romans actually had a specific word for modesty. I don't want to butcher it, so I'm just going to put it up on the screen. It was treated like a public virtue, especially for women. Women who dressed or behaved immodestly could be seen as challenging the moral order of society. Roman historian Catherine Edwards explained that modesty wasn't just a personal trait, it had political implications because it reflected the health and discipline of an entire society. So again, modesty was normal. It wasn't considered restrictive at the time. And fast forward to medieval Renaissance Europe, and you'll see that women used to cover their hair, and it was kind of a standard amongst certain groups of women. Christian women wore veils veils or hoods, not because they were oppressed, but because covering the hair was tied to ideas of dignity and respectability. You can see this in like the religious paintings that you see in churches and writings of everyday life. Fashion historian Elizabeth Wilson notes that modesty was tied to class, morality, and femininity at the time. In the Islamic world, modesty wasn't an invention of modern times either. Muslim women wore garments like the khimar or the jilbab for years, following the Quranic instructions to do so. These references are widely agreed upon by classical scholars like At-Tabari or Ibn Kathir, who interpret them as clear guidelines for modest dress. What's interesting is that for most of Islamic history, this wasn't controversial. It was just a part of culture, and modest dress was normal for Christians and Jews at that time. Even during the Victorian era, which wasn't that far away from us historically, modesty was kind of at an extreme compared to today. Women were expected to cover their arms, legs, chests, and sometimes occasionally their hair. Dresses were designed to avoid showing certain parts of the feminine form. Valerie Steele, a fashion historian, explains that these norms were tied to ideals of morality, purity, and social status. The bottom line is that modesty has been the norm for most of human history. The idea that covering up is somehow strange, oppressive, or outdated is actually very new. And that specific shift is what we're going to be focusing on when we talk about why the hijab today feels very difficult to wear. Up until 100 years ago, modesty was completely normal everywhere. Well, basically everywhere. But there's something important to acknowledge, in that in many societies, the burden of modesty fell much harder on women than it did on men. Men could dress more freely, participate in public life without the fear of being judged for their bodies, and move through the world with a kind of social invincibility that women didn't really get. Women's clothing was often tied to ideas of purity, class, and I guess this like reputation that they were trying to uphold, while men rarely had the same expectations that were placed on them. Over time, that imbalance created this kind of frustration. A lot of women began to associate modesty norms with double standards rather than a representation of shared values. And in some cases, that frustration pushed the culture toward a complete rejection of modesty altogether. And you can see this as a kind of pendulum swing. If a society pushes one extreme for too long, like restricting women's bodies, controlling their mobility, obsessing over their decency, eventually the reaction is going to be equally as strong but in the opposite direction. So when modernity sped up, people started questioning old institutions. Modesty became one of the first things to be tossed out, not because modesty itself was inherently bad, but because of the way it was applied in a way that was often unfair or gendered. But the pendulum didn't just swing because people were fed up. There was something major that happened in the 20th century, and it wasn't simply that women wanted this new freedom. It was a combination of technology, ideology, and capitalism reshaping what it even meant to have a body in public. In the 1960s, counterculture introduced a new idea that modesty equals repression and that showing more skin leads to liberation. Sociologist Stephen Sedman describes this shift as a political redefinition of sexuality itself, where exposure became a symbol of freedom, self-expression, and a resistance against old hierarchies. Whether someone agrees with this logic or not, the result was really dramatic. Clothing became less about social boundaries and more about personal autonomy. Nudity and minimal clothing weren't just fashion choices, they were statements. And a new culture had emerged from that point, and it began to spread this narrative rapidly, especially in Western societies. And then capitalism decided to enter the conversation quite aggressively. Once companies realized that sexual imagery sold products, the female body became a marketable tool. Sociologist Jean Kilbourne's research shows how the advertising industry intentionally used women's bodies to sell everything from perfumes to cars, slowly training consumers to believe that exposure equals empowerment. This created a new kind of pressure where you weren't just choosing to show more skin. You were being told that by showing it, you were more modern, confident, and socially valuable. And it turned the body into a product and visibility into a kind of currency. Then the internet came along. Great, right? Social media and eventually platforms like Instagram and TikTok. Suddenly, the body wasn't just a product in advertising. It became became a product that individuals could sell, display, and monetize themselves. Anthropologist Natasha Scull describes this shift as part of the attention economy, where visibility becomes the main resource and the body becomes a primary asset used to attract that attention. Online, people who showed more tend to get more views, likes, engagement, and opportunities. And the algorithm literally rewards exposure. So the modern norm isn't just do whatever you want with your body. It's show yourself, perform, be visible. And in that kind of culture, modesty no longer reads as normal. It becomes deviant. When people talk about modesty today, they often focus on the cultural expectations or family values. But honestly, the biggest force shaping how we think about our bodies right now isn't really traditional at all. It's the internet. Digital media transformed the way we perform identity, and it did it so quickly that most of us didn't have time to question it. The first major shift started with social media turning the self into content. Most platforms like Instagram and TikTok are built around visibility. The more you show, the more the algorithm will reward you. So even if someone isn't intentionally trying to be provocative, the system pushes users towards more exposure because that's what performs better. And then when we consider monetization, we understand that the body now isn't just something that you can have. It's something that you're often encouraged to brand, market, and sell. Social scientists call this weird reality self-objectification, when people begin to view themselves from the outsider's gaze in anticipation of how they'll be received. And even though men also participate in social media, women are disproportionately rewarded for this visibility. Studies show that female influencers grow faster and receive much more engagement when their content focuses on aesthetic or physical appeal. This reinforces the idea that to be relevant online, a woman's body has to be part of the entire brand. Finally, there's an emotional side to this, in that attention feels good, literally. Neuroscience research shows that likes, views, or any kind of online engagement activates the brain's reward system in the same way other addictive stimuli do. So the more visibility someone gets, the more they want to maintain it, and the harder it becomes to then embrace modesty, which we know naturally limits your visibility. So when people talk about this modern shift, digital media isn't just another factor, a throwaway factor. It's the environment that we live in, and it shapes what's normal, what's desirable, and what's rewarded. And in a world where body is currency and visibility is the price of relevance, modesty feels like you're kind of fighting against all odds. And as Muslims growing up in the modern world, we often hear these weird notions that hijab is culture, or that it's oppressive, or I don't know, any weird connotations toward the hijab. But when you look at the actual historical context, for most of human history, modesty was normal. Covering was normal. The boundaries around the body were normal. And hijab didn't really stand out. So why does it feel so hard now? It's not because the hijab suddenly became restrictive. It's because the world around us became less modest. And the hijab now stands in direct contrast with that shift. And there are three main reasons why I think the hijab feels harder today than it probably did any other time. And all of them have to do with the cultural environment that we're living in, and not much to do with the religious practice itself. We live in a culture that values display and not privacy. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman calls our current era liquid modernity, meaning that everything is consistently shifting. Identity, morals, values, and relationships. Nothing stays solid for too long. And in this kind of environment, people rely heavily on external displays to define themselves. It's almost like you're supposed to show who you are instead of be who you are. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's performative a little bit. Bowman argues that identity today has to be performed, curated, and broadcast in order to feel real, and that puts a huge amount of pressure on appearance. When we look at what hijab represents, it basically tells the world that you don't get access to who I am. You don't get to define me based on how I look, and my value isn't public property. And that message completely clashes with modern expectations. It's not that the hijab is extreme. extreme. It's that it contradicts the entire logic of our current environment. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but the modern culture kind of treats the body like it's something that can be packaged, marketed, and sold through ads, through social media, through influencer branding, etc. And the shift from modesty to exposure, it didn't really happen organically. It was shaped by industries that benefited from women being hyper-visible. Naomi Wolf explains this very clearly in The Beauty Myth, saying that even when society frames exposure as empowerment, it often functions in a way that benefits companies and not the women themselves. Because the more insecure you are, the more you spend. The more visible you are, the more profitable you become for these advertisers and platforms. And the hijab kind of disrupts this entire concept. And it automatically feels like a rebellion. Even when you're not trying to rebel, it'll feel like you're rebelling, simply because the culture depends on women not doing that. So when you hear Muslim women say the hijab is hard, it's not because Muslims themselves are weak. It's because modesty asks you to detach from a system that profits off of your visibility, and that system fights back. The hijab resists the attention economy. This is the biggest point. We live in a world where attention is everything, and platforms are designed to reward whatever captures attention the fastest. And whether we like it or not, the human brain is wired to be drawn to physical appearance. That means that content that shows more skin, more beauty, more body, spreads faster, performs better, and gets more validation. Modesty doesn't perform well on these platforms, not because it's wrong, but because the algorithm itself isn't built for it. The hijab reduces the sexualization that drives the engagement. It kind of removes the instant appeal that the internet thrives on. So when you put on your hijab, you're not just going against cultural norms, you're going against the literal architecture of the digital world. And it's worth saying this clearly. The hijab feels hard not because you're doing something extreme, but because you're trying to resist an environment designed to make modesty inconvenient. The hijab didn't suddenly become difficult. Historically, it was just one cultural expression of modesty among many. What changed is everything else. Society went from valuing boundaries to valuing exposure. The body became a marketable tool. Visibility became a requirement for relevance. Digital platforms rewarded aesthetics over privacy. Women were told empowerment means being seen, not being protected. And this all is happening in a world where hijab feels countercultural. And honestly, that tension, I think, makes it much more meaningful. The struggle isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that the hijab is confronting forces most people don't even realize they're shaped by. The difficulty of wearing hijab isn't about putting it on. It's about the environment that we currently live in. And that's exactly why I think it's one of the most necessary grounding practices for Muslim women today. But before we get there, let's be realistic first. The hijab doesn't solve all of our problems. It won't end sexism. It won't eliminate harassment. It won't magically protect you from judgment, objectification, or pressure. None of that disappears because you put a scarf on your head. But that doesn't mean that the hijab has no impact. There are very real, observable ways that it interrupts unhealthy dynamics, especially in a world that treats women's bodies as public property. And to understand why that matters, you kind of have to go back to what the purpose of the hijab is in Islam. Hijab is an act of worship. One of the biggest misconceptions even some Muslims have is that the hijab is primarily centered around men, as if the goal is to protect men from temptation, preserve a woman's purity, or keep society under control, or whatever that means. But the framing doesn't come from Islamic theology. It comes from centuries of patriarchal cultures where modesty was used as a tool to regulate women's behavior, and often with minimal expectations placed on men. But Islam flips that story entirely. In Islam, the hijab is rooted in obedience to God, and not in any way in obedience to male authority. Quranic verses about hijab address women directly, without presenting men as enforcers or regulators of this practice. Classical scholars like Al-Qurtubi and Ibn Kathir emphasize that modest dress is part of a woman's personal relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not a system of male control. So the hijab is not designed to make a woman controlled. It's designed to make a woman accountable to God, and only to God, and not to those shifting expectations that society places on women. And that's what makes the hijab so powerful and maybe a little threatening in a world where you define you from the outside. We hear this all the time. that the hijab protects women. But protection doesn't necessarily mean that you'll not face any harm. It doesn't mean that men will suddenly behave perfectly, and it definitely does not mean that a hijabi woman is responsible for what men do. Protection in Islam is much more nuanced. The hijab protects by reducing exposure, setting boundaries, and changing how you present yourself in a world where visibility is constantly weaponized. And it's more about your closeness with God than it is about anything else. And this doesn't necessarily guarantee your safety, but it does reduce vulnerability in a system that's designed to exploit women. In a society where the body is used as currency, the hijab kind of protects your boundaries by refusing to participate in that entire market. And this is where the hijab becomes countercultural in the best way. The modern culture tells women to be confident is to be visible. To be empowered is to be desired. And own your body by showing it. But what all of these messages have in common is that it places your value in the hands of the viewers. The hijab says that you don't need to perform for your worth. You don't need to exist for any kind of public consumption. You're allowed to be private. And if you really think about it, that doesn't crush your freedom. It expands it. It takes the pressure off of you, off your body, and redirects your worth towards something internal, stable, and aligned with your faith. At its core, the hijab is a reminder that your relationship with God is of utmost importance. Not the algorithm, not the public, not men, and not trends. And in our world that's obsessed with self-branding, sexual presentation, aesthetics, constant visibility, something as simple as covering yourself becomes a radical act of grounding you. And it shifts your focus from the external validation to something internal, and to perform with sincerity, and to only look for validation with things that are aligned with God. And that's why the hijab feels hard. And that's why it matters, because everything in our environment pushes us toward display. The hijab pushes us back to dignity and humility. And even though it doesn't solve every problem, it undeniably changes the way you walk through life. And right now, we're living inside this cultural contradiction, and nobody really knows how to navigate it. On one hand, Western society constantly tells women to be authentic and to do what feels empowering. And on the other hand, the same systems quietly pressure women to perform a very specific version of empowerment, one that's marketable, visible, and sexually appealing, and usually for someone else's benefit and not yours. And this is where the problem lies, I think, that the modern world claims that everything is about choice, but in reality, the choices that women are being pushed towards are shaped by algorithms, advertising, and an attention economy that rewards exposure and punishes modesty. It's no coincidence that women who cover up, whether for religious reasons, cultural reasons, or just personal values, are treated as if they're rejecting progress instead of simply choosing a different form of self-expression. What makes this moment even more complicated is the fact that so many women are stuck between the two extremes. A past where modesty was enforced through shame and through surveillance, and a present where hypervisibility is rewarded to the point that opting out makes you look insecure or oppressed. And neither side is truly offering women any kind of peace of mind. And this is why the hijab becomes an uncomfortable topic of discussion for the Western mainstream narrative, or I guess culture. The hijab doesn't fit into the narrative that says that empowerment comes from displaying yourself, but it also doesn't fit into the old order of the Western narrative that modesty is centered around protecting men from desires or keeping women in their place. The hijab stands completely in its own category because it's grounded in, first and foremost, worship, submission to God before anything else. And I think that's the part that most people don't really understand. They think that the hijab is a tool for men to control women, or a symbol of patriarchy, or any kind of censorship, a form of censorship. But in Islam, the hijab was never designed as a social strategy to manage male desires. It wasn't even created by men for men. Its primary meaning and purpose is between a woman and her creator. Its spiritual purposes comes long before its social benefits. But does the hijab magically solve every problem that a woman would face? Of course not. It doesn't eliminate harassment or insecurity or any of the current systems. Muslim women never claimed it did, and the Quran also does not claim to do that. But what it does do is remove certain layers of objectification and shift the focus away from sexual display as a default expectation. It creates a boundary in a world where it kind of refuses women to have any boundaries at all. And most importantly, it roots the boundary in something that's internal, something that's sacred, and not in fear or in any kind of male authority. So right now, we are at a point where many women are kind of exhausted by being watched, judged, consumed, and marketed to, yet are also unsure how to step out of a system that teaches them that visibility is the only way to matter. And that's exactly what the hijab is going to disrupt for many people. And it creates a whole new narrative. It introduces a different logic, one where dignity doesn't depend on viewership, where self-worth is not really tied to any sexual currency, and where modesty isn't about hiding or being in fear, but actually about defining yourself on your own terms and focusing on your relationship with God. So when we look at this entire conversation as a whole, you start to realize that the debate around modesty was never really about the clothes themselves. It's always been about who gets to define a woman's worth and what is she expected to offer to the world by existing in that definition. Every era creates its own pressure, and in the past, modesty was enforced as a social duty, but today exposure is pushed as a professional and personal asset. So neither of these extremes is ever truly neutral, and women have always felt the consequences the most, I think, and that's why so many of us are tired. We're tired of being fed an identity that we have to accept instead of being allowed to build our own, and build one that shapes how we think and what we believe in. This is why the hijab disturbs so many people. It doesn't necessarily play in the court of the old rules, but it also doesn't align with the new ones. It doesn't fully work with the past or the current forms that the West has presented. One that connects a woman to something much higher than public opinion. And in a way, I guess that's the real challenge of our time, in that it's not about choosing between modesty or exposure. It's about finally stepping out of that pendulum swing altogether. It's about learning to live in an in-between space where it's not about the fear of judgment or about this desperate need for validation. It's finding that balance where your body is not seen as a commodity, not seen as a way to perform, and is simply something that you protect, and it belongs to you and your creator before anyone else. And maybe that's where we need to kind of slowly return to. A world where women choose with clarity instead of feeling this kind of pressure. A world where dignity, it's a state of being. And if we can get there at some point, then maybe we'll finally be living in a world where I guess we understand what empowerment actually is and not what we think it should be, I guess. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I'm sure many of you will disagree, but I guess it was my 2 cents on the entire discussion.